Dear friends and colleagues, thank you for your kind invitation to offer some opening reflections to your important conference. I must confess that these days I'm much more nervous than I was as a 15-year-old activist fighting against the apartheid system. And the reason for that is best captured in this story. Speaking to an audience in the United States a couple of years ago and reflecting on the state of the world, during the Q&A time, a very upset delegate put up a hand and said, "Mr. Naidoo, have you heard of Martin Luther King?" And I said, "Yes, I did. He inspired me and many other people in my home country, South Africa, in our fight for justice." And she said, "Do you know what his most famous speech was called?" Thinking it was a trick question, I very gently said, "I have a dream." And she shouted back at me saying, "Yes, it was I have a dream, but when you speak, it sounds like you have a nightmare. The forests are disappearing, the oceans are rising, inequality is on the rise, emissions are shooting up, and so on." Herein lies a key challenge of the moment that we find ourselves in. We have to be able to speak truth to power, to analyze the deep crisis that we find ourselves in, and also the fact that we have a convergence of multiple crises, not just climate, but rising fascism, deepening inequality, conflict, and so on. And how do we do that on the one hand that is honest, but doesn't demobilize, demotivate, and create a sense of despair and depression where people feel there's no purpose of actually trying to make a difference? So I want to start this message by saying that the moment of history that we find ourselves in, pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. And that the pessimism that might emerge from our analysis, our observations, and our lived experiences can best be overcome by the optimism of our thought, our creativity, and our courage. When I was the head of Greenpeace International in July of 2015, I spent some time in the Pacific, in Vanuatu, in Fiji, and in Kiribati, pronounced Kiribati. And I learned a very painful slogan while I was there. People in July of 2015 were chanting the slogan, 1.5 to stay alive. 1.5 to stay alive. 6 months later, at the Paris climate negotiations, I meet the same new friends of mine from the Pacific, and they asked me to come and address a meeting just outside of the negotiating chamber that they got permission for. So I joined them and I think, oh, let me respect what I learned from them, and I'm about to start chanting 1.5 to stay alive. And they say, no, the slogan has changed. And the new slogan is 1.5, we might survive. That was a very chilling experience for me, and one that should move all of us. But sadly, for far too long now, we have not had the kind of response that was critically needed. And we have ignored the most powerful nations in the world, those often, most of them, who play the biggest role in driving up emissions and so on. Their corporations as well as the governments paid lip service to the actions that we needed to take. Let's be very clear. We cannot change the science. All we can change is political will. And thankfully, political will is a renewable resource. As we reflect in the moment that we find ourselves in, we have to recognize that while we are winning many significant battles in our fight to averse catastrophic, runaway, irreversible climate change, we are patently losing the overall war. And one of the reasons we must accept now why we are losing is that those of us who are in the movement to promote climate action, whether you come from government, business, or in civil society, we are part of the problem because we talk a language that is inaccessible to the vast majority of people. We aim most of our narratives at the head and the brain, where we are talking about science, targets, policies, proposals, and so on, often in a language that is alienating and excluding of the vast majority of people in the world, including those who might have had a benefit of a university education. What we have failed to do is what Donald Trump and Steve Bannon and the ilk do, which is they ignore the brain and they shoot everything at the heart and try to move people through weaponizing hate of various kinds. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should deviate from the facts, but we have to be able to present the facts in a way that is much more moving, much more creative, much less boring. That is the challenge that we absolutely face today in the overall climate justice movement globally. Also, because activism starts often from a point of how people are excluded, marginalized, oppressed, repressed, and so on, one of the mistakes we appear to be making unwittingly is that we imagine, therefore, that because people have been through so much historically, from colonialism to slavery to the various other injustices that people have had to face, that we think that people are having less agency than they do in reality have. So part of what we need to do is to conceptualize of multiple different ways in which we think of ways in which people can participate. And it's critically important that we recognize that the scale of the challenge that we face in shifting public opinion will require the biggest ever mobilization of people that we've ever seen on the planet with the greatest level of urgency. And part of how we do that is also about recognizing that we need to pick up ideas such as artivism, where we bring arts, culture, and activism together to move people with sufficient urgency and with a sufficient sense of you have to be part of the solution. I want to now turn to the topic of your conference, carbon dioxide removal. The first thing we must acknowledge, the very fact that we're having this conversation about the need to embrace carbon dioxide removal is a recognition of failure. Had we acted in 1992 or shortly thereafter, after the first Rio Earth Summit, we would not be in the crisis that we are in. We have incremental baby steps in the right direction periodically, and then we have quite a lot of one step forward, two step backwards. When new challenges emerge, such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it seemed to us in the global south that the commitments that Europe had made on climate suddenly became very, very negotiable and very, very compromisable. This is not good enough. And therefore, when I think about the people in the Pacific Island states, for example, and other least developed countries and island states in general, I am tortured by the fact that we have let those communities down. That in fact, right now, without considering carbon dioxide removal as a serious part of our strategy, we do not have a chance to save and secure the future of people in the most vulnerable places around the world. Now, let me just say, for many people within the climate justice movement, we have considered many of these initiatives, which started, of course, with carbon capture and storage and so on, as moral hazards. That if this was put on the table, it will discourage the fast withdrawal from our addiction to fossil fuels. So therefore, with much trepidation before the COP in Egypt, I penned an editorial on Al Jazeera's website saying, whether we like it or not, we have to now consider responsible, science-led carbon dioxide removal strategies. I want to share with you what response I got to that, particularly from the people I've worked with and people who I love and respect, who are in the front lines of action against climate change on a day-to-day basis, sometimes putting their lives at risk and sometimes losing their lives. It was one of the most painful discussions I've had in my entire life. There were mainly folks from the Global South and a few folks from the North who requested the meeting, and of course I made time to register in no uncertain terms with me how unhappy they were that I had taken that position. Their concerns were, yes, for example, they would say, correctly so, that if we build algae sea forests, for example, in the ocean to draw carbon dioxide, that might appear on the surface to be unproblematic. But what does that mean for other changes that we might see in the ocean and the marine life more generally? There is a deep concern that we will have to engage in interventions that will risk further damage without the science verifying whether a particular strategy is actually appropriate and so on. For me, the two reasons why I felt we have to do this and engage with it in as responsible and a people-centric way as possible. One is the fact that whether people in the Global South, like myself, like it or not, sadly, this train has left the station. Hundreds of millions of dollars globally now are already being invested by private companies as well as governments in exploring this area. So long as it's happening, my view was we have to get on top of it and try to make it as just, fair, science-led, and so on. The second is, sadly, I have to concede that there is no pathway for the people of the Pacific Island states and other most vulnerable countries right now, given that we are pushing on the 1.5 degree target that we were supposed to stay under. So yes, we need to do everything to stay under that target or be as close to it as possible and do that which is needed as the primary strategy, which is carbon emissions. But even if we did all of that, the reality is the carbon is in the atmosphere. Even if tomorrow we switched off all emissions, we are still in deep trouble because, as you well know, the carbon dioxide remains in our atmosphere. So therefore, I conclude by saying that we also should hear the concerns that if there's going to be large-scale projects to do this, it would potentially be sited in the Global South. And the Global South, yet again, will be exploited and be used as a guinea pig for some of these. These were some of the issues that my colleagues raised with me. And it was with great sadness I ended that meeting, recognizing the pain, recognizing the risk that this could send a signal to some quarters that, hey, maybe we need to slow down on emissions reduction. I hope that's not the case. I argued that I believe that train has left the station and we've won the argument and so on. However, Europe's own performance following the Ukraine invasion by Russia does raise questions about how easy it is to go back to old ways of being. So I appeal to you in your deliberations today to ensure that, one, any carbon dioxide removal strategy should be science-led, should be governed by an inclusive global governance arrangement. The best I can see at the moment, in the absence of other options, is perhaps the IPCC can be asked to review any technologies and so on that are being proposed to ensure that it would take down carbon on the one hand, but create some other catastrophe on the other. And third, we need to ensure that the voices of the Global South, who are marginalized from this global conversation at the moment, are centrally included. We also have to clarify, how is carbon dioxide removal different from carbon capture and storage, which made exaggerated claims about its efficacy when it was first talked about and delivered very, very little. So I also urge you not to get to a situation where we are making exaggerated claims about what CDR can offer without making sure that we can verify in very specific target-related ways that we can actually achieve that. I want to conclude by wishing you a wonderful conference, a productive conference, and one that will lead us to a world where carbon dioxide removal is done in a just, equitable, sustainable, and inclusive manner, and one in which people, particularly from the Global South, are made to be a central part of the solution, and to do that in ways that frontline communities are engaged in very serious, real, and respectful ways. Muchas gracias, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for allowing me to offer these comments.